Has anyone here ever been a soldier fighting against the US? What was it like? My great-grandfather talked to me about being a Canadian in World War II. When a Canadian plane flew overhead, the Germans dove for cover. When a German plane flew overhead, the Canadians dove for cover. When an American plane flew overhead, everybody dove for cover. This will probably be buried, but my great-uncle fought for the Germans in the Battle of Normandy. He said that they were told that the Allies were being pushed back into the sea, and that any Allies they saw were most likely small units that had slipped by. A few days later, my great-uncle woke up to find a regiment of Americans camped inside of the farmhouse they were in. Him and his squad surrendered. I worked for a private contracting company where we worked with bilingual Iraqi personnel for training scenarios. One of the men I worked with was an ex-Republican guard that fought against us in Desert Storm. He was a very nice guy with an open mind and amazing stories. After Desert Storm, he got citizenship in America and now helps us train soldiers at multiple bases in the US. This is the kind of thing that's great to hear, and it underscores the fact that many soldiers don't necessarily have a personal stake in the wars they fight. They sign up to protect their country, but it doesn't mean they hate the country they're fighting against. Even if they do, they're still people whose opinions are subject to change. For some reason, many people seem to forget that. Does getting bombed and attacked by allied US troops count on this one? If so, I'll try to get in touch with some old military buddies to post here. This comment scares and confuses me. While I cannot speak from the experience, I'm an American, I can relay something my father mentioned to me a few years ago. He was a Marine during the conflict in Grenada, and he was also active during the First Gulf War. He's never gone into great detail about his combat history, and frankly, I wouldn't want to have him rework those memories. But he did mention one time how you can see a man's fear before you see him. Kind of cryptic, I know, but that one statement says a lot. He mentioned how you could hear them yelling, and that the yells were not the confident kind. He meant that these men knew they were about to fight Americans, with all their fancy toys and extreme training. They knew that the Marines were coming to kill them. My dad always told me that one of the greatest weapons our military has is the image that we conjure in the minds of our enemies. While it's one thing to fight someone who you feel is an equal or lesser match to you, it is a completely different scenario to fight someone who you truly feel is a monstrous force of war. I can't speak for the other branches, strictly because I don't have a close personal relationship with someone who's enlisted, and I've never enlisted. However, I can tell you that my father and all of his Marine buddies are absolutely vicious if prodded into an aggressive situation. They knew that the Marines were coming to kill them, if I recall correctly. In Grenada, the Marines were only supposed to take the top 10% of the island and the army the rest. The Marines landed and began their attack. At the end, the Marines held about 90% of the island and the army the rest. The oppositional forces were fleeing from the Marines to fight the army. Although it's not what this comment concerns, it brings to mind thoughts of Vietnam. The Americans weren't scared because their opponents had uniforms or fancy weapons. Quite the opposite, in fact. They were scared because anyone could attack with a grenade or other weapon at any time. The truth is that anyone with a weapon and a dedication to ending your life could be considered a monstrous force of war. Combat is terrifying. It's interesting to hear how it looks from the opposing point of view. I think it's important we remember that all soldiers in all nations have an equal propensity to be scared. In World War II, the Germans and some of our allies often commented on how chaotic the U.S. Army appeared to be. I believe the quote was, "War is chaos, and the American Army practices it on a daily basis." Other armies were slow, disciplined, methodical, etc. The perception was that Americans were unpredictable, undisciplined, but prone to ingenuity. Not just generals, but right down to the grunt soldier level. I understand most who fought us viewed this as a great strength. Not the enemy, but was in communications. We would get intel from counter-intel guys from intercepted cell phone calls. Taliban was scared poopless when it came to engaging Marines. One report that I remember well was a commander ordering guys to engage in firefight because they wanted to do a show of force. The guy he was ordering gave a million excuses and was scared of the new Marines because they thought we were special forces. We had a bunch of new gear, chest rigs, radars, thermals. They ended up engaging a patrol later that week. We killed most of their cell that day. I think the fact that there's hardly anyone talking about fighting against the US should be taken as a sign. I actually played paintball against US Marines once. It was scary stuff. They were in New Zealand as embassy guards and completely destroyed us on the attack. However, they couldn't play defend the flag very well. I have to comment on this one because I've played both paintball and laser tag against people who play a lot of Call of Duty. They take it so seriously. I can only imagine playing against actual military. But it's just nice to know the military from various countries can get together to enjoy some harmless activities and escape the chaos now and then. Maybe it's not on par with that classic story about Christmas in the trenches, but it's nice to know that the same spirit is still alive. I have a neighbor from Vietnam that participated in the Vietnam War. He told me most of the time he was on the run and hiding in trees, waiting to shoot at U.S. soldiers. After an ambush, his group would get the frick out, as they didn't want to get torched. I have a girlfriend from Iraq who had brothers in the Iraq army. They defected pretty quick and live here now, but they tell me how insane the American arsenal was. While Iraq soldiers' main method of transport was pickup trucks, motorbikes, and bicycles, the Americans were transporting people in armored personnel carriers that were impossible to damage. Also tells me that the quality of training was noticeable, as you would never see the Americans. You would just be shot, because they knew how to move from cover to cover and remain undetected. Her brothers never killed anyone. They defected once troops entered the country. They were only 16 at the time. If you've seen the movie Lone Survivor, you know how real this concern unfortunately is for American soldiers. We've had no shortage of children in our wars, but that's been cut down on in recent decades. However, the same can't always be said of those we fight. Soldiers sometimes have to choose between fighting someone who's not even old enough to rent a car or protecting their lives by cutting someone down before their prime. Next to the threat of losing your own life, it's one of the most terrifying war realities anyone will ever have to face. It'd be kinda hard to face all of those wrecks to respond to this. Number 1, be a soldier. 2, be in a country against the US. 3, be in actual combat. 4, survive it. 5, go on Reddit and find this post. Plus 6, want to write a response. My great uncle was on the Italian side in World War II and was a captured prisoner of war to America. From what he told me, people wanted to be captured by the US. They were treated badly by their own and knew how great America was. My great uncle fought on the German side of World War II. He fought all over the place: Africa, Italy, a small stint in Russia, and he defended France from the D-Day invasion. He was later able to move to the United States as a war refugee. He said that a lot of his officers would constantly tell him, when you're fighting the Americans, you must think of the least probable way they will attack you, because that will be the way that they attack you. He also said that when you were fighting Americans, more so than any other country's army he fought, you had to have eyes in the back of your head. It's always crazy to read comments like this, particularly because of how late America entered the war. From an American perspective, we like to either assume that the Allies wouldn't have won without us, or that we simply entered after they'd done most of the work. It's not this channel's intent to debate either of those views, but it's definitely interesting to know how our entrance was viewed by Axis powers. Hopefully those powers will remain allies, so neither party will have to be put in that position again. My grandfather was conscripted to fight for the North Korean military during the Korean War. He was at the Battle of Incheon, and he likened the dread that he felt to what one must feel when faced with a massive tidal wave that is about to engulf you and everyone you know. Couple this with the fact that many North Korean troops were told horror stories, that the American troops were cannibals, for example, and that the average American Marine was much taller and more physically robust than the average North Korean soldier. You can imagine how scared he was. He said that the Chinese and North Korean units were absolutely obliterated, and that they never stood a chance against the Marines. All his words, not mine. It is important for Iraq as internet, and while they may not have all agreed with the war, some fought for Saddam. Maybe they want to say something. Also Serbia, Somalia, Grenada, Desert Storm 1, Vietnam, and then there are instances of friendly fire. I'm sure it isn't any less scary just because it's an accident. Maybe even an Argentinian who fought the British has special insight. It would still be an account of fighting a massive Western military. From Iraq here, my father fought on the defensive lines in Iraq during the Gulf War when the West forces entered Iraq. He said it was very scary to have planes fly over. You do not see them when they're coming because they're very fast, so damage and deaths happened with no warning. Planes were followed by soldiers, but he did not get close to them. He said everyone knew the fighting was pointless because Saddam was not a good leader, and he thought he was. Saddam thought he could fight back, but the UN had better leaders and more tools. My father told me it was like fighting a bad disease, because you don't know what you're fighting and you don't know how to fight it. That's one of the best analogies for fighting an unknown enemy that I think I've ever read. Just compare it to the recent pandemic. There's this new threat, you barely know where it came from, and everyone's just guessing at the best way to eradicate it. Military intelligence makes the best assessment they can based on what little data they have, while sweating endlessly as they try to uncover more info. Those who question military leaders are like those who yell at the TV during a football game. Your hindsight ideas might be great, but playing from the field is a way different experience. Hopefully this won't get buried, but my hopes are not too high. My father was a sniper during the bombardment in Yugoslavia, and my best friend's father was a member of the elite unit called Tigers while war in Kosovo was raging. I'll be short because I have to sleep, but my father told me it was like trying to repel a wave on the beach by building a castle out of sand. You fought, you may have won some small counters, be it by accident or pure luck, but you always knew that if they wanted, they could just kill us all and be done with it. Not a nice time for you, Yugoslavia, that's for sure. Former active army infantry here. Not sure how I'd feel if I met someone who told me they were former JAM. There were dozens of different armed groups fighting each other and fighting the coalition forces at the same time. My first deployment, it was mostly the Mahdi army. On the one hand, a lot of them were poor, unemployed kids with zero prospects for employment or education. The only possible option for them was to grab a rifle and show up with the rest of the ski masks and run into coaxial machine gun fire, or dig a hole for $20 and get blown apart by an Apache. So I have some empathy for the plight of the poor, uneducated, unemployed Shiite youth who took up arms to fight the imperialist stormtrooper invaders. Sure, yeah, if Red Dawn happened, I'd be in the woods with the Wolverines too. Roger that. On the other hand, kidnappings, torture, physical violation, execution, burning the Sunnis out of their homes, corruption of the police force, the 3 dead preteens we found kidnapped, tortured, and murdered, the 10-year-old kid shot in the head right in front of me by a sniper, the 90-plus civilian murder victims we found just in the first month of our combat tour, the kid whose tongue they cut out because he liked to chat with us when we rolled by his neighborhood. The fact that Muqtada al-Sadr is now an officially recognized member of the Iraqi government. So yeah, I can't do it. I can't forgive them. My cousin Javier was in Fallujah during 2004 with the army, and it was a logistical cluster F sometimes. He told me about having to kill kids barely in their teens. That dude is all sorts of freaked up the army was there first. Out of everyone in this post, he probably has the most complete grasp of what went down in the opening years of that war. I wish I knew how to comment on this. These stories are terrifying. I want to believe that the story of the 10-year-old needs more context. I want to believe that someone had a good reason to feel threatened by him. And I want to point to the fact that too many countries still enlist children into their military. But the unbridled truth is that war crimes happen, and they aren't always punished. I can't directly speak to these experiences, but I can at least declare that if we're truly dedicated to bettering the world, we need to stop fighting each other and collectively find a way to cut down on them. Both of my grandfathers were on the German side for World War II. They didn't say much about the Americans until after the war and how helpful they were rebuilding Germany and donating chocolate to kids, etc. But both sets of grandparents told horror stories about facing the Russians. Seems they were peeved at the scorched earth they had to do to defeat the German push and made them pay dearly and daily. They emigrated to the US because they ran so far west, getting as far away from the Russians as possible. Gonna be buried, but oh well. My dad was an anti-aircraft gunner in Hanoi during the Vietnam War. He still wakes up screaming in the middle of the night, quite often really. I'm an American soldier, so I'm not what you're looking for, but I'm guessing you won't find much on here. So I'll give you an analogy from some evasion training I got to when getting ready for less visible operations. We were learning how to escape if you're being chased, and one of the things we trained for was trackers using dogs. The dog handlers explained it like this. Look, the dogs we use are so good at what they do, so perceptive that they will find you, but you won't be able to fool that dog. So you need to fool the handler. Travel in erratic patterns, backtrack, make it seem to the handler that the dog has lost the scent and is just wandering. You can't beat the dog, but you might be able to beat the man. That is what fighting the US military is like. If the man behind the dog has decided you're the enemy, you've already lost. There are many, many brave fighters out there, on our side and against us, but when it comes down to it, we are going to win in a direct fight. Sure, bad things happen and we lose a battle here and there, but in a war, we will win. The trouble is that the world is learning. No one wants to fight us in a war anymore. They don't go after the dog. They go after the man behind the dog. Jack up the cost of the conflict, cause civilian casualties, forces us into lose-lose situations, and our support crumbles. Then our handlers say, "Okay, boy, we're not finding him today. Let's go home." Well said. The dog analogy is a good one. It's scary, but it's good. The best military units don't simply run in barking at anything and everything like an untrained animal. They sneak in with their nose to the ground and sniff out where they're needed most. The idea of beating the man instead of the dog basically means that you need to see behind this. You need to be able to identify where the unit's orders are coming from, as well as how and why those orders are given. This is relatable no matter which country's military you come from. I am actually former U.S. Army. I spent an entire summer serving as an OPFOR, opposing force, at one of the Army's elite training centers. Basically, I fought U.S. soldiers in a giant simulation. I'd actually agree to some extent with the pushover comments from some units. The U.S. Army is just so dang massive, some units certainly will look completely incompetent. Also, outside of a few soft units and light infantry, there isn't a whole lot of emphasis placed on toughness. However, combat arms units are no freaking joke. We have the best, most expensive training in the world, and by far the best equipment. I would not want to be on the other team. Chances are I'd be dead before I even saw an American soldier. I'm currently in the U.S. Army right now, so I'll do my best just to describe what I see. The basic way of looking at it is the people we fight know that there is no way they could ever beat the U.S. military. It's just too big and too technologically superior. However, their goal is never to win. It's impossible. You can't beat us in a stand-up fair fight. So to counter this, they just make their goal to not lose. And while it is impossible to win against American forces, it is very easy to not lose. Whether it be a country like Russia and China, or a group of rebels like the Taliban, they all understand to not try to beat us, just counter us. They adopt countering tactics to deny us all of our superior traits. They know they can't outmaneuver us, so they use IEDs and mines to deny us freedom of maneuver. They can't gain air superiority, so they develop anti-air missiles to shoot our planes down. They can't beat our navy, so instead of wasting money building huge ships, they build missiles. China just developed an anti-carrier missile. In Afghanistan, they can't build a stable government, so they just try to undermine ours. The basic fact is eventually the American public will get sick of war and decide it's time to go home. All they have to do is wait, and they will win every time. America hasn't lost any wars. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they're all the same. We kill thousands, maybe millions. It doesn't matter, so we just go home. We no longer win wars. We just don't lose them. Eventually, we will go home tired. While it's a little weird to say America's never lost a war right before mentioning Vietnam, the rest of this comment makes sense. However, it's not true that it doesn't matter. In fact, that doesn't seem to be true for most soldiers. But the rest of it sounds like the way Homer Simpson wins a boxing match. Just wait and your opponent will tire out. Good to know that strategy has broader implications. Yeah, this is the closest I've got to an answer. My family is Panamanian. Being a civilian in a country invaded by US, troops are terrifying. A tank stopped in front of my grandma's house and started firing over it once. My cousins were all really young when it happened, and they were absolutely terrified. Unfortunately, I don't have access to someone who may have fought for Noriega, the dictator at the time that the US was ousting. I didn't fight against the US, but fought for it. I remember seeing a man, an enemy I guess, die of a fairly pointless death, though I was at a comfortable distance, I suppose. I can't confirm it, but I know he was a man with a hungry family who was paid a meager sum to take shots at the Iraqi police. They mowed down his house. There's quite a bit I still carry with me from Al-Anbar province, though it's been many years. I suppose part of me will always wonder at how fundamentally unfair life can be, but never as much as when I was over there. Now, every yellow ribbon and thank you for your service carries a residual guilt that I have difficulty communicating. I'd like to think that if I could remake the world, it wouldn't be as such. After all, what would I do in his place? Probably the same. The world is full of decent men in indecent situations. I suppose the worst part is the inability to effect any meaningful change. Too long didn't read, ain't it all a mother effer? It certainly is, but this story shows just why. It's one thing to talk about how terrible it is that American soldiers often face underaged or underfunded opponents, but the other important thing to realize is that many of them know that already. They go into these combat situations realizing that their opponents may not have the upper hand, yet they still have a job to do. This man was willing to put those experiences on the line, even knowing that he might receive hatred for it. That takes great courage. My great-uncle flew A6M0 Zeke fighter aircraft for the Japanese Imperial Navy. He survived one attack on an American carrier task force, but was wounded and relegated to light duty in China. He described the first time seeing U.S. fleet circa 1944 as both inspiring and extremely disheartening. Simply the futility of trying to fight the U.S. I'm not a soldier that fought against the U.S., but my uncle knew this guy who heard a story once. Nice try, CIA. My name is Michael Weston. I used to be a spy. I actually gave a talk on this topic today, not just the US, but basically on the losing side. I suppose I'd sum it up as the winners write history. I guess the end result of facing an army like the US, a technological monster, is you're not going to be the one writing that history book. Currently in Berlin, and I just get my group, Australia, US, Canada, etc., to imagine no war memorials in their towns. No Veterans Day, no Anzac Day, no parades, no walls listing the dead, and then I remind them that for a large proportion of soldiers here during World War I and World War II, it wasn't they were evil, it was they were, in their minds, fighting for their home, the same as our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. We get to remember our dead soldiers, to raise them up as heroes. Those that lose, don't. It's a strange but powerful thing to be allowed to remember. Please do not take this as me trying to lessen the atrocities committed during World War II. Of course, there's no way of lessening the atrocities committed in any war. Each side has to do what they feel they have to do in order to win. But stories like this are important because they remind us what that looks like from a civilian perspective. Your own side is trying desperately to win, yet you may not feel comfortable with how they do so. That's something we unfortunately all have to live with in times of war. I read an interview of an Al-Qaeda member fighting against the Syrian army in Aleppo. He came across the border from Iraq, where he was a veteran from fighting U.S. troops there. He basically said they were all lucky they were fighting the Syrian army because if it was America, they would have all been killed by drones, helicopters, and precision bombs a long time ago. He said Americans always know what's happening because of the drones, satellite pictures, well-developed communications between units, etc. The Syrian army is in the dark all the time, so they fire artillery and drop bombs semi-randomly. Moons ago, I had a father-in-law that was part of the German paratroopers during World War II. He was taken as a prisoner of war during the Battle of the Bulge and sent to a camp in England. He said that with the level of fighting he engaged in, he was scared, and he did not think he was going to make it out alive. That is what they were told. The Allied forces would not allow them to surrender. They will shoot them no matter what. He was captured when he was discovered hiding in a building. He said he had no time to react, and it was get shot at or give up. He said he was treated very well in his prisoner of war camp. He has since died, but he was a colorful guy. He chalked it up to a countryman called into service on his country during that time. He had a lot of stories about Germany during that time. It was an interesting perspective. I was just a 7-year-old kid when my parents were watching CNN or BBC while I was playing video games. It was about some army jets taking off during the night. My dad turned to me and said something along the lines of, "It has begun. Get to the basement, now." Sometime later, the first explosions could be heard. The NATO-US bombing of Serbia in 1999 had started. I remembered spending time in the basement with other residents. I remember how the building shook when the bombs exploded. The fear of what was coming after the sirens went off destroyed all 3 bridges across the Danube in my city, cutting us off from a part of our family. One day, a bomb hit the refinery, so we couldn't stay in the basements anymore because of CO2. Then, a bomb hit about 100 meters from our building, and shrapnel went through at the blinds and windows and embedded itself into the opposite wall of our neighbor's flat. That was when we decided to move somewhere where the Americans had nothing to aim for, a smaller town. We were safer there, but we could still hear the jets flying above us and bombs going off in the distance. When someone shot down the F-117 stealth jet, it was a huge frick yeah moment for Serbia. That's my short story of surviving the war versus USA. I remember the same things, only it wasn't NATO shooting at us, but our countrymen, as you say, only the tactical targets, of course. This is yet another fascinating story for how much it tells us about war in general, despite being written from a purely personal perspective. Many nations fight on behalf of what they believe to be larger causes, yet they affect those who are simply trying to live their lives, whether that means sitting at home and ignoring the bombs or actively running from them. No war affects soldiers alone. People like this commenter deserve to be respected, for they bring to life the true struggles of those in war-torn nations. But what's your perspective? Is war necessary, or does it only serve to hurt civilians? Please, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.